Okay, so today is day 2 of solving absolute value equations. So remember the rules. Make sure you go through and you follow the steps. So step 1 is to make sure you isolate the absolute value first. That means you need to undo any operations that are outside the absolute value. And after you do step 1, you want to check to see if there is a no solution situation, meaning you can't have absolute value cannot equal a negative distance. Then you need to, if there's not a no solution, you have to write the correct number of equations, right? Most of the time it's 2. And then obviously from there you want to solve the equations that you have. Okay, so looking at number 1, we want to first isolate the absolute value. And do you see and notice that there is an adding 2 and a multiplying by 4 to the outside of the absolute value? So we need to undo those first. Remember, we undo adding first before we undo multiplication. So we need to subtract 2 from both sides. Then we can undo the multiplying by 4 by dividing by 4. And then that gives you absolute value k minus 8 equals 3. Now that's not really correct. So when you divide by 4, you get 1, and 1 times the absolute value leaves you the absolute value. So you got to have the absolute values there. And I'm just going to emphasize, isn't this now step 1? So isn't step 1, done? Check mark. Step 1 is done. So we finally undid everything that was on the outside of the absolute value so that we had just the absolute value. Then we want to make sure that the distance is not negative. So the distance is not negative. The distance is a positive 3, which means we want what's inside the absolute value. So we want what's inside the absolute value to be 3 units from 0, right? 3 units from 0. So we have 2 equations, equation 1 and equation 2. So k minus 8 could be a negative 3 units from 0, or k minus 8 could be a positive 3 units from 0, right? So we could have been either a negative 3 units from 0 or a positive 3 units to 0 if we're talking about being 3 units. And then we just need to solve for each equation. So I need to add 8 to both sides. And that gives me k equals 5. And add 8. And that gives me k equals 11. So we can use set notation and say 5, 11 are the 2 values that would make that original sentence true. So we're going to be looking for this critical step. So this is called a critical step. And we need to make sure that you have officially done step 1. And then from step 1, if it doesn't have a negative distance, then you have to write your 2 equations and then solve them. Okay, let's look at the next one. Okay, number 2. Step 1, isolate the absolute value. Notice that we have an add 8 outside the absolute value, so we have to undo adding 8. And that gives us absolute value m plus 5 equals negative 5. And then normally you would write 2 equations, right? But wait a minute, stop. Right, that's my stop sign. Stop. Don't we have a negative number? So when you have a negative distance, how can you be negative 5 units from 0? You can't be 5 units from 0, so you shouldn't be writing any equations. You should have stopped and recognized that you have a negative distance, and you can't have a negative distance. Therefore, you should stop and say there's no solution because you cannot have a negative distance. Number 3. We need to, step 1, undo anything that's on the outside of the absolute value. So we need to undo adding 8 by subtracting 8. And that gives you absolute value 4n plus 6 equals 0, right? 8 minus 8 is 0, so don't forget that that's 0. That's not a negative distance. So now it says we need to be 0 units from 0. So remember, we got to be 0 units, right, from 0. So where must you be standing? Right, you have to be standing on 0. So this one, there's only one equation. So this is a special case, right? If you're 0 units from 0, don't you actually have to be standing on 0? So there's only one equation. 4n plus 6 can only equal 0 because you have to be standing on 0 to be 0 units. And then you solve that one equation. Undo adding 6 by subtracting 6. Divide both sides by 4. And you get n equals -6/4. And right, we can reduce by 2, so we should always reduce our fractions down. So that divide by 2, that gives you -3/2. So our answer is -3/2, and if you want, you can put that in set notation. Okay, so when you're 0 units from 0, isn't that the only time where you're just going to have one equation instead of 2? Okay. Problem number 4. So some kids will subtract 3 from both sides, and that is wrong because the +3 is inside the absolute value. You cannot undo stuff that's inside the absolute value, so that is wrong. That is not correct. So we've got to stop and erase that. So step 1 is to isolate the absolute value. The absolute value is already isolated. There is nothing outside of the absolute value, right? If I highlight the absolute value, do you see anything on the outside of the absolute value? So it's already isolated. So now we can go to step 2. Step 2 is to make sure that we don't have a negative distance. And so we don't have a negative distance, so we're good. And then remember, we have to write our equations. Should we have 2 equations or 1 equations? If it says your distance from 0 has to be 6, if your distance from 0 has to be 6, couldn't you be over here at -6? And couldn't you be over at +6? So see, you will have 2 equations because you can be on the negative side or the positive side of 0 to be 6 units from 0. So we could say what's inside. So remember, we're just copying what's inside. So x plus 3 could equal -6, or what's inside x plus 3 could equal a +6. So remember, if you have absolute value bars when you're writing your equations, that is not correct. That is not correct. So I had to pause and go back and rewrite it without having the absolute values. So we're talking about what's inside, which is x plus 3, could either equal +6 or -6, right? And then we can solve those 2 equations. So we can undo adding 3 by subtracting 3. Watch your integer skills. Undo adding 3 by subtracting 3. Watch your integer skills. So -9 and +3. It doesn't really matter which one you write first. Do you have to write it in set notation? No, but you should get used to writing set notation. So it's good practice. Okay. So on this one, you might say, whoa, shouldn't we stop? It's a negative distance, so shouldn't we stop and say no solution? Well, no. Have we done step 1 yet? Is step 1 done? Is the absolute value already isolated? And you can see that the absolute value is not isolated. It's not, there's something outside. So remember, we cannot analyze if it's a no solution until after we've isolated the absolute value. So we can't analyze that yet. So don't we have to undo the multiplying by -2 by dividing by a -2? And isn't a negative divided by a negative a positive? So see, we have a positive distance, so we're okay. So it's really not a no solution situation. So you have to have step 1 done first. So step 1 done. You have to isolate the absolute value first. Then after that, you can check for a no solution, which in this case, it's not a no solution. So then we can move to step 3, which is to write the correct number of equations. We want to be 7 units from 0. So to be 7 units from 0, what's inside could be 1/3 m minus 5, could be on -7, right? Or what's inside could be at +7. So if we're 7 units from 0, we could be standing at -7, or we could be standing at +7. And notice I do not have any absolute value bars in the writing equation step because we're talking about what's inside. We're going to be looking for that. And then don't we want to solve each equation by undoing adding and subtractings first? And we could divide by 1/3, but isn't it just faster to multiply by the reciprocal? Remember, that's how we show multiplication. And that gives you m equals -6. Undo subtract 5. Instead of dividing both sides by 1/3, isn't it a lot faster just to multiply by the reciprocal? The reciprocal of 1/3 is 3, so we're just going to multiply every term by 3, and that gives us m equals 36. So our two answers are -6 and 36 are the two answers. Okay, in problem number 6, check which equations would be no solution. Remember, to check for no solution, you cannot have a negative distance. So a no solution means you cannot have a negative distance. But before you look with your eyes to see if it's a no solution situation, don't you have to have step 1 done first? So look at each of these problems. Which ones have step 1 already done? Here, step 1 is done. Here, step 1 is not done. Right? Don't you have to undo the add 8 first? Here, is step 1 done? Is it already isolated? No, you have to add 8. In the next equation, is the absolute value already isolated? Is there anything outside the absolute value? Yes, so we have to undo that first. So you have to have step 1 done first, right? You have to undo the multiplying by -2 first before you can analyze if it's a no solution. So in problem number 1, isn't it already isolated? And then don't we have a negative distance? And the fact that we have a negative distance, isn't this going to be a no solution? So this one is going to be no solution. Number 2, the second one, we have to first undo the adding 10 by subtracting 10, right? You have to do step 1 first. You have to have it isolated first. That's going to give me 11. So here, step 1 is now officially done. And now I can look with my eyes and see, do I have a negative distance? So I'm okay. I have a positive distance, so this one's okay. Here, I have to add 8 to both sides. And that gives me the absolute value of a is +3. So now I've isolated, and step 1 is officially done. It's now isolated. And that is a positive distance, so we're okay. And the second one, we have to subtract 7 from both sides. And doesn't that give me a + 3 equals a -5? Step 1 is officially done. I have isolated the absolute value, and I have a negative distance. So this is going to be a no solution problem. You might think this is a no solution, but you wait, stop. Is step 1, is the absolute value isolated? And the answer is no, it's not isolated. We have a multiplying by 2 on the outside. So we have to undo multiplying by 2 by dividing by -2, sorry. And doesn't that give you x + 8? And isn't a negative divided by negative a positive? So I do not have a negative distance, so this one's okay. So the only two that gave me a no solution situation was the first problem and the third problem. Those are the only ones that gave me a no solution. So you have to isolate first, and then you have to look with your eyes and analyze if you have a negative distance. So step 1 must always be done first. Okay, last problem. Number 7, absolute value of 4k equals 14. So some students will divide by 4. You cannot do that. 4 is on the inside of the absolute value. You only undo things that are on the outside of the absolute value. So that is incorrect. That is not right. So you cannot undo things that are on the inside of the absolute value. So isn't step 1 already done? So step 1 is already done. Right? So I'm going to put a check mark for step 1 is already done. Step 2, do we have a negative distance? No, we don't. So it's not a special case. Step 3, write the two equations or one equation. Do you remember what has to happen to give you one equation? So we are saying that we have to be 12 units from 0. So to be 12 units from 0, couldn't we be standing, so couldn't 4K? So 4K could be at negative 12, or 4K could be at positive 12, right? So if I say you need to be 12 units from 0, that means you could be standing at negative 12 or positive 12, and you would be 12 units from 0. Once you write your two equations, then you can solve your two equations. So we're going to undo. Now we're going to undo the multiplying by 4. And we're going to undo multiplying by 4. So our answers are negative 3 and positive 3. Okay,